Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the Victorian October tag. So for Victorian October, which is currently going on, and if you do not know, is a month-long read-along / literary booktube event where 5 of us are encouraging the rest of you on booktube and in the world to read more Victorian literature. As part of this Victorian October, we decided that we would make a tag video. Yes, this is the Victorian October tag, or the Victober tag, and we have some exciting Victorian-related questions for you. This tag has been created by me, by Alicia from Ex Libris, by Ange from Beyond the Pages, by Yamini from The Skeptical Reader, and by Kate Howe. Within the tag we have 10 glorious Victorian-related questions, and then we also have 5 bonus questions at the end, which are specifically related to a particular author, so we thought we wouldn't include them in the main tag in case. Yes, let's begin with the Victorians. Question number 1. What is the first piece of Victorian literature you ever read? Now, I think the first Victorian thing I ever read was probably The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley, which is a Victorian children's book, which I read when I think I was about 8 or 9, probably. It was certainly before I properly got into Victorian literature when I was 13, and I don't remember The Water Babies at all, so I think I must have been quite young. And it's about a chimney sweep who possibly dies and then gets into this other strange world where he lives underwater and there are lots of children underwater, and that is about as much as I remember of it. I know that it also had quite a lot of social commentary on the way that chimney sweeps were treated and was quite instrumental in passing acts in Parliament about the ages that children could be chimney sweeps at. But apart from that, I don't know much about it, but I remember enjoying it when I was about 9 or 10. Question 2 is, what is your favourite Victorian novel that you have read? And as we all know, my favourite Victorian novel is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, because it is my favourite novel of all time. I talk about this enough that I feel it isn't much worth me repeating what it's about here and why I love it so much. I will link down below my What the Dickens video where I talk about what a wonderful book this is, but I love it so much. The book begins with this grand fortune that a man called Mr. Harmon has made through dust and rubbish, and through rifling through heaps of dust and rubbish in order to try and get some worth out of them. This fortune is left to the man's son on the condition that he marries a particular woman. As this man is on the way back to London to claim his fortune, he is found drowned, and the book carries on from there. It is very dark and very funny and very beautiful and very, very brilliant. Question 3 is, who is your favourite Victorian author? If you have watched more than, say, one of my videos in the past, you probably know of my love for Dickens. I'm pretty keen on him. I think he is a wonderful, wonderful author. I love the balance Dickens has between humour and emotion, between the really dark social criticism but also really, really funny, witty writing. I love the emotional impact of his literary couples and the way he writes love stories and families and the connections between individuals. I love that his characters are so unique and original, and even though they're all eccentric and a bit too eccentric to exist in reality, they all have little elements of reality in them, and although they are extremes of the kind of people who do really exist, and I love that they are all so unique and individual. Even the very minor characters who just like pass by another character in the street all have their individual characters, and I love that. I think it's great. I love his long, huge novels with all of the winding, twisting plots that all weave together at the end in a beautiful, beautiful way, and I just think he's a great, great writer. He is so good. He is my favourite. Question 4 is your favourite Victorian literary couple. Now, I have quite a few contenders for this. One is Margaret and Mr. Thornton in North and South, a love story that I greatly, greatly love. North and South is the plot of Pride and Prejudice, plus an awful lot of social criticism, industrial mills and strikes. It's just brilliant, blending that lovely, wonderful love story with all the social criticism that I love about the Victorian period. Margaret and Mr. Thornton have great conversations, and I love that a lot of their drama and the tensions between them are to do with their differing moral ideas and their different ideas about how is the best way to serve people and what is the best thing to do, what is your moral responsibility and where does it end. I love all that dynamic. Also in Charles Dickens's Little Dorrit and her gentleman, shall we say, in case it's a spoiler. I love that relationship because one of the things that really annoys me in early Dickens is that all of his romantic love interests, they just like fall in love with each other on sight. There is a lot of insta-love in early Dickens, like in Nicholas Nickleby and so on. There's just a lot of people looking at each other and immediately they are in love, and I find it quite grating at times, and I know that Dickens can do better, and I feel in Little Dorrit he does do better, and there is this relationship that is so much more than just like a momentary love and is something a lot deeper and a lot more complex and a lot more well explored, which I really enjoy. But another contender for my favourite Victorian literary couple, not that I mainly read Victorian literature because I greatly love the love stories, though that is a part of it, but there is a couple in The Egoist by George Meredith, which is a great novel, and it's the couple that kind of emerges near the end, and I can't really say who it is without big spoilers because it's not a couple that you see coming in the way that you normally do in Victorian literature, not really. It's a beautiful, beautiful relationship that emerges at the end of The Egoist that I was such a big fan of, because all the way through I was like, maybe this could happen, this would be exciting. And The Egoist is not as easy to follow as other Victorian literature. It's quite deep and quite dense and quite a difficult novel, but to have that kind of relationship under the surface that I thought might develop and then did was just wonderful. That was great. I enjoyed that. Oh, what a book. One of the most fascinating books in terms of the Victorian exploration of gender. But anyway, more on that another time. Question 5 is, who is your favourite Victorian literary villain? And for this I will have to return to the glorious Our Mutual Friend, because Bradley Headstone of Our Mutual Friend is my favourite literary villain of all time, one of my favourite literary characters of all time, definitely my favourite Victorian literary villain. He is much more than a villain. It would be wrong to simply refer to him as a villain, because he is one of those characters who is oddly sympathetic, even though he is also quite sinister. I love Dickens, as I have said and will say many times, but one of the reasons why, for me, Bradley Headstone is Dickens's greatest villain and greatest sinister creation is because you really, really feel his motivation. You can almost view him as a tragic hero. He almost views himself as a tragic hero, and he serves his purpose not only as a character but to say something about the Victorian ideals of respectability, because Bradley Headstone is a respectable man, but all of his emotions and passions have been so suppressed and bottled up within this respectable exterior that when he cracks, he really cracks a lot. And the way that Dickens does this is very, very interesting, and for me he's one of Dickens's most interesting characters and most well done villains, because you completely understand exactly what he's doing, and he's not just motivated by money or something like quite a lot of Dickens villains are, but he's motivated by something very deep and very complicated and very messed up, but also you kind of understand it, and it's so good. Read this book, it's so good. Question 6 is your favourite Victorian novel in which someone dies of consumption. Now this was a slight in-joke between me and the other people who are running Victorian October, because as we have read Victorian literature, we have discovered that again and again everybody dies of consumption. Everybody. Which is possibly just telling of the fact that many people in the Victorian period did die of consumption, but it does feel like something that happens an awful lot in Victorian literature. Part of the difficulty though with answering this question is that in a lot of Victorian literature people die of consumption but they don't say it's consumption, and there are a lot of unexplained, slightly mysterious deaths within Victorian literature that are implied that they are because of consumption, but it's never really stated. My favourite of these, which I think is implied to be consumption, is within the novel Dombey and Son, which is my second favourite Dickens novel and my second favourite novel of all time, and is a brilliant masterpiece of a work. I will not say more about this death because of spoilers, but oh, that book makes me cry a lot. It makes me cry a lot. I once listened to the audiobook while out on a run and started crying. It was fun. Question 7 is the longest Victorian novel you have read. Now, I'm trying to remember from when I did the big books tag which Dickens novel was longest. It's definitely a Dickens novel, and I think Little Dorrit and Bleak House are the two longest of Dickens's novels, so one of them would be the longest ones that I have read. Both very great books, both in my top 5 of Dickens and definitely in my top sort of 20 books of all time. They're both very, very good and quite long. But there's something for me about Victorian long novels that really, really work, because a lot of Victorian novels were published serially and had a lot of characters and a lot of interweaving plots. The length really works for me, and it never feels like it's too long. It just feels like it's a great world you get to jump into for a very long time. So I enjoy the length of Victorian novels. And Question 8, a Victorian author or novel you have read that you feel is underrated. There's two I want to mention here. One is George Gissing, or especially George Gissing's The Netherworld, which is the only one of his I've read, and I really need to read some more because it's very, very brilliant. Gissing really reminds me, from what I have read of him, of an urban Hardy. He deals with a lot of similar themes to Hardy. It's a similar writing style to an extent and is equally at times depressing but also brilliant, but it is in an urban setting, and within The Netherworld he deals a lot with the poor of London and how poverty affects people and what it can drive them to, and the way that these characters who are deeply affected by poverty are driven to lead their lives. It's a brilliant, brilliant book, so good and so powerful, and I think he is very underrated and I really want to read some more of him. I'm hoping to read New Grub Street later this month. And another novel I feel is very underrated is The Egoist by George Meredith, and I will say, which I said when I read this back in whenever it was, January I think, I don't think this is a book to start with Victorian literature. I think this is a book to read later on in your journey into Victorian literature. For me, I read quite a lot of Victorian literature. Reading The Egoist was of a difficulty level more akin to reading Shakespeare than to reading the other Victorian novels I've read. It was difficult and it took me a long time to get through, but it was brilliant and so rewarding. And if you do enjoy Victorian literature and if you are interested in the Victorian period and in the way that gender operates within the Victorian period, I would really, really highly recommend The Egoist, because it's just so fascinating in the way that it explores gender roles and the way that marriage is viewed within Victorian society. It is about a couple who get engaged, and then a little while after they become engaged, the woman starts to realise that maybe she doesn't want to marry him after all, and it's about how she tries to extract herself from that engagement, and it's just brilliant. The way it examines the power play between men and women within Victorian society is just incredible, and although it was a difficult book, once I got into it I loved it so much, and I really, really highly recommend it. I think it is very underrated. Question 9 is, what is the most beautiful edition of a Victorian book that you own? Now, I do own a couple of Dickens first editions, which are my most treasured possessions of anything that I've ever owned, and are very, very beautiful, and they have all the original illustrations in, and they're lovely, and they're Victorian. I do not have them with me. They have not come to the new flat. They have remained at my parents' house, where they will be safe, as I wasn't certain, you know, if there would be damp in this flat or anything like that, and I think they're best kept somewhere where I know they're definitely safe. And my most beautiful editions of Victorian books. I did do a video a while ago when I had all of my old books with me about all the old and antiquarian books that I own, so I will link that video down below if you want to see the first editions and other pretty editions. In terms of slightly more modern editions of Victorian books, I do love the Collector's Library series. I think these are gorgeous because they are hardback, which is really nice, but they're so small. They are read inside with gold writing on the spine, which is really nice, and I really do enjoy them. I think they're very pretty and nice. Finally, for the main part of the tag, question 10, what are 3 unread Victorian books that you would like to get to? So, excluding all of the books that are already on my TBR for Victorian October, there are many of them. There are still many more books that I would like to get to. I would like to read some more by George Eliot. I wasn't the hugest fan of Middlemarch or Silas Marner when I read them as a teenager, but I read Daniel Deronda recently and actually really enjoyed it, so I'd like to read something else by her. I don't really want to read The Mill on the Floss because I've seen a TV adaptation of it and I didn't enjoy that, so I think that would spoil it for me slightly. But I am very interested to read Adam Bede or Felix Holt the Radical, which both sound quite interesting. I'm also very, very keen to read another novel by George Meredith. I don't know which one. He actually wrote quite a lot, like so many of the Victorians did, so I don't know which one I want to get to next, but definitely something more by him. I'd also really like to read Hester by Margaret Oliphant. Margaret Oliphant is one of those authors who was very, very, very well selling during the Victorian period, but I haven't actually read anything from, and I really should. And then moving on to our final 5 bonus questions. The first one is, what is your favourite Bronte novel? Now, my favourite Bronte novel has to be Wuthering Heights. It's a tough call between that and Villette, but I think ultimately it is Wuthering Heights. I've just read Wuthering Heights so many times, and every time I read it I discover new things about it. I know it is an acquired taste, and I know that a lot of people expect it to be a grand love story, and it's not that. It's a book about revenge. The book is split into 2 halves, the first half about one generation, the second about the next generation, and the way that traits change and the way that things are carried down, the way that the doubling exists between the 2 generations is just wonderful. I'll link down below my Bronte Week video on Wuthering Heights where I talk about in full why I love it so much, but I think it is brilliant. I love that it's so complex and layered that you can never get to the truth of the matter. I love that it is so violent and full of weird supernatural imagery in the dialogue, and I love that I hate every single one of the characters, but I also really want to read about them, because that is pretty impressive to me. The next bonus question, what is your favourite Dickens novel? Of course it is Our Mutual Friend. I need say no more. Next, your favourite Hardy novel, which for me is much harder to decide. It's quite a tie between Far From the Madding Crowd and Jude the Obscure, both of which I love. Far From the Madding Crowd is about a woman called Bathsheba who inherits a farm from her uncle and ends up getting caught up with 3 different men who are interested in her, and it's just beautifully written, beautifully done, very, very complicated, and the way these characters intersect just works very, very well. And then there is Jude the Obscure, which I really, really love, and I think possibly if I was pushed to decide, Jude the Obscure would probably slightly beat Far From the Madding Crowd. In Jude the Obscure, it's about a man called Jude. He grows up quite poor, but he's very interested in Latin and wants to go to Oxford, or Christminster as it's called within Wessex, to study, but he is always pushed down and finds that every time he tries to educate himself he meets with various barriers, so he ends up becoming a stonemason. And there is another complicated aspect to his life. He makes a mistake in his romantic relationships very early on in life, and the book deals a lot with the complications of what it might mean to be living with someone outside of marriage within the Victorian period. It's a book that really challenges a lot of the moral ideology of the Victorian period in a brilliant, brilliant way, and it's just beautiful. I find it so incredibly moving, and the dialogue is so good, and it's just such a wonderful, wonderful book. Next, your favourite Gaskell novel, which is another hard one for me because I really think Mary Barton is incredibly brilliant, but North and South still has to win because it's the first Gaskell novel I read and it's one of my favourite novels of all time. It is so good. As I mentioned earlier, it combines a similar romantic plot structure to Pride and Prejudice, but there's also social criticism and strikes and mills, and it's great. And I love the central relationship in it, and I also love the way that family is explored, and it's just beautiful. It's great. It's so good. Finally, your favourite Trollope novel. Now, Anthony Trollope is one of those Victorian authors that I really do enjoy and think is a little bit underrated. It's nice that quite a few of us on BookTube, including me, have been reading through the Barchester Chronicles at the moment because it's nice to see a bit more attention paid to Anthony Trollope. My favourite Anthony Trollope novel, however, is The Way We Live Now, which is one of my favourite books of all time and is a brilliant, brilliant book. It is one of those epic Victorian ones in which there are a lot of different plots interweaving with each other. The Way We Live Now begins with this economic giant called Melmotte moving into London with his family, and he has all this money but not that much class, but he brings all these people to him because he has this great fortune. The book explores the way that Victorian society treats money and what this use of money does to the way that Victorian society works and the way that relationships work and the way that marriage works, and it's just absolutely brilliant with so many wonderful characters, and it's just a superb novel with great social criticism. So there we have it. That brings me to the end of the Victorian tag. This has probably been quite a long video, but there we go. I do always have a lot to say about the Victorians. I'm going to tag some other people who I know are joining in with Victorian October. I'm going to tag Caroline from BBC Girl, I'm going to tag Amanda Center, I'm going to tag Petra Yu, and I'm going to tag Lucy the Reader. And in general, I'm just going to tag anyone who is joining in with Victorian October. I hope you are having a nice Victorian month, and I'll be back very soon with another Victorian video.